Sorcerers in Jujutsu Kaisen have a hardly linear path. They are some of the most up and down development characters that we've seen in a lot of shonen, and that is speaking a lot because there's so many different power systems. But one of the fun things about JJK's power system, at least in the beginning, was the fact that it did seem to allow for almost anyone to develop into a high-level sorcerer. That may not be the case by the time of modern JJK, but when we started, and through a good portion of its run, that was definitely a factor. And that can be seen nowhere better than with Yuji Itadori. Because Yuji had such a pronounced glow-up throughout the entire series, I do think it's worth talking about just how much he evolved as a sorcerer. So one of those things you have to keep in mind is that when Yuji started this, he was supposed to be a normal person. Now, he wasn't quite normal. He still had above average stats in physicality and fighting ability, but even so, it was nowhere near on the level of anybody else in JJK when he started. And growing from that, he learned how to be able to fight cursed spirits, first with tools, but then later with his own divergent fist. And then, his enhanced physicality lended it to, I guess, him interpreting the world already differently. So when it came to having to think about the world differently as a sorcerer, he blended quite well into it. Moving through walls, going up and over buildings, a lot of stuff like that just came more naturally to him. I think there's also a good point to make that he developed more on his combat skills. He'd always been good at fights, but there's a difference between fighting like in a street gang or fighting in a gym versus fighting as against cursed spirits and other sorcerers. And he had to adapt to that, but he adapted to it really, really quickly, which is why he was so prominently able to take on, frankly, terrifying curses and sorcerers in, the Shibuya Incident. I think the Shibuya Incident was the first time we ever saw Yuji really start to develop full out as a character, especially since he had to have some single combat fights during it. Now, I've talked in the past of why I think all those one-on-one fights actually ended up being bad for the sorcerers, and I still think that's true. But it was kind of cool, at least in the beginning, to get the vibe that Yuji especially had progressed. Most of the sorcerers that he runs into comment that he basically already is a grade 1 sorcerer, which is a big compliment. He's essentially that one step down from special grade. I do think that's why ranks like special grade 1 were added in to give a bit more distance to that, but since they're never really explained, they're kind of just empty titles. Grade 1 is a definitive rank, and Yuji's pretty much said to be on par with it. That's really fast development because he's not even out of his first year in Jujutsu Technical High School. So he had a very big power-up going into Shibuya Incident, and it really showcased, and I think he came out of it probably at the strongest in the series because he was able to defeat Mahito. Now, there's the big back and forth on, did he actually beat Mahito because he didn't strike him down? Yes and no, he probably could have done it, and I do think that was a mistake on Gege's part, but he was going to. Whether you like that or not is neither here nor there. So, if he's that strong, being able to take on a special grade cursed spirit, that's a big consideration. The funny thing is, he's really self-sufficient going into Culling games, but when he's in the Culling games, he doesn't really get paired off against anybody that quite rivals anything that he did in Shibuya. If anything, he kind of steps a bit more into the background. I'm not saying he got weaker at all, he definitely didn't. He just didn't have as many opportunities to show off his strength. If anything, Culling games, I think, showed off more of the side cast and Megumi's abilities than it did anyone else's. But now that we have entered, the final arc, there's that big question of, has all of this evolution for Yuji, all of the training in Divergent Fist, all of his physicality, really paid off? Well, let's look at all the techniques he's acquired. The first is that, like I said, he has adapted to his sorcery, his cursed energy, all of that really, really well. He is now able to utilize that probably better than the vast majority of sorcerers that we've ever seen in the series, almost secondhand, like it's part of him naturally. Another big consideration is that he is very, very skilled in hand-to-hand combat now, probably on the same level as Kusakabe in terms of weapons proficiency, or Maki. Because we don't have his full stats yet because of the way that this story's been laid out, but we know that he's gotten proficient with some cursed tools. He seems to have developed, he at least has reverse curse technique now, which is a big deal. We know that's a very rare ability among sorcerers. There's always that theory that he's developed some kind of technique, but at the very least, proficiency with reverse curse technique and specialized curse tools is a very large statement, and he's gotten that strong. Plus, he is semi-holding his own in the fight with Sukuna. And while I've expressed issues with that before, you can't say that he isn't doing well with it because he certainly is. He's still alive, which is a big marker. So I think if we look at Yuji as the case study for what a sorcerer with no powers, no special up, glow-ups getting merged with anything in particular, because, let's be honest, Sukuna was not an aid to any of this. The only thing he gave him was resistance to Mahito's technique, which doesn't count anymore. And I guess technically making him aware of the second soul, which is probably key and intrinsic to the plan now, but it didn't affect his development as a sorcerer. It's not even fully confirmed that Sukuna was the one that awakened his own cursed energy, although that is hinted at. It's really said that he developed that on his own, like training with Todo. So I feel that he's really evolved, and that's good picture for it for the entire series.